Good evening. I'm political editor Dennis Welch, and this is Politics Unplugged. In the audit and election security in the headlines, the Secretary of State's race in next year's election, definitely going to be one to watch. At least 4 candidates are already running. On the Republican side, you have State Representative Mark Finchem and State Senator Michelle Ugenti-Rita. Now, over on the Democratic side, you have State Representative Reginald Boulding and former Maricopa County Recorder Adrian Fontes. And Mr. Fontes is joining me now to discuss his campaign. Welcome. Thanks for taking some time to talk to us about this. First question for you is, why do you want to make a run for this office? You are coming off a defeat just a few months ago. What do you think you bring to the table here?
Well, look, in 2016, we ran a great grassroots campaign and overcame an enormous incumbency to really get into a system and improve it. And 2020 really wasn't a loss. We ran the best election Maricopa County has ever seen, and that was the job that needed to get done. Now we need to look to the crossroads that we find ourselves at and make sure that Arizona is on the right path. I have the experience, I have the know-how, and I certainly have the drive to make sure to work together with all Arizonans so that their fundamental rights are preserved.
Well, I know you can characterize that, and sure, you feel that way, that it wasn't a loss because you feel proud about your campaign, but at the end of the day, it was a loss. You lost in Maricopa County. It's the same year that another Democrat for another office, Sheriff Paul Pinzone, he was the top vote getter in Maricopa County. So as far as electability, winnability, how do you expect to win a statewide office when you couldn't carry Maricopa County last year?
Well, Dennis, it's funny that a lot of people are so concerned about politics and they just shove off the idea that the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States of America had the best election ever. And that was the job I got elected to do. I know that there's folks out there who think that politics is more important than the fundamental right of every single voter. But when we prioritize the job that needs to be done and the job that needs to be done well during a global pandemic, and during an onslaught of misinformation and disinformation like we saw in 2020, it was an absolute victory across the board. You know, the political insiders may not agree with that, but the folks out there who had the rights preserved, I think they think we did a good job.
Exactly. And, you know, it's important, though, you got to win that election before you can implement any of that policy. So now let's talk a little bit about what you want to accomplish if you're able to win this seat in 2022. What's your top priority?
Well, what I want to do is very similar to what we did in Maricopa County. We increased the number of voters in that one county by 500,000, from 2.1 to 2.6 million in just 4 years. We increased the number of ballots cast by 600,000 between 2016 and 2020. That's access for all American voters. And I'd like to take that pro-voter program across Arizona to make sure that in the north and northeast part of the state, everybody has access to the ballot box, to make sure that the languages are appropriately represented across all of Arizona, to make sure that not just our large metropolitan area voters, but folks in rural counties and communities across the state have the information that they need to cast their ballot so that we can preserve and protect this democracy.
And what's your you know, Secretary of State, if you're able to win that position, you're going to have to be dealing with, you know, potentially a Republican-controlled legislature. Are you going to be able to work with them? You've seen what's happened this year. Let me get your take on that.
Well, look, when I got elected in Maricopa County, I faced a 4-1 Republican Board of Supervisors with essentially the same duties. They set my budget, they set a lot of the policies, and I worked hand in glove with them to improve all of the systems that got improved. And it was a little bit of a rough start for the first, 2 or 3 months. And once we got to know each other and started working well together, we took Maricopa County from something that was lacking into a best-in-class operation, one that specific board themselves, they're defending it tooth and nail against the onslaught from a lot of other folks. I can work across the aisle because I focus on the business of the office, not on the politics, not on the posturing, and not on all of the rest of the stuff that gets, you know, so easily mixed up in the distractions of the day. I will stay focused, and I think people respect that.
And, you know, you did work with the Republican-controlled Board of Supervisors, but I know some of your critics and potentially some of your opponents are going to make some hay out of the fact that you entered into an agreement with the board, and your critics are saying what you did was you ceded power over the election to the board. I want to let you respond to that.
Yeah, Maricopa County had been operating under a system starting in 1955 that was wrong. And what had happened was the Board of Supervisors ceded their statutory power to the county recorder. What we did when we took office was return the county operation into something that's more aligned with state law and state statute. We gave a lot more of the power back to the board where it belongs and the responsibility back to the board where it belongs. So we have more of a checks and balances between the recorder and the board, which is appropriate, and that's how the statute was designed. Maricopa County was one of the very few counties in Arizona that had that model in the first place. So surrendering or ceding power from the recorder to the board isn't what actually happened. What really happened was the board took back the responsibility they had given up so long ago, and I was very happy to work with them to make sure that we had a system that kept going and operated ultimately very, very well for the voters.
Yeah, and understood. But I have spoken to some critics of yours and whatnot, and what they say is like, look, voters didn't elect you to give power back to the board. Respond to that.
Voters didn't elect anybody to give or take power. They elected us to do our job, and we did our job. My job was to make sure we had the best election possible, and the best election possible within the law. And if that means that we had to get the board to take back some of its responsibilities under the law, well, so be it. I get what the critics are saying, and I'm happy to respond directly to them. And the response is just that. I did my job. I did the job I was elected to do. And they're critics because they don't have anything else to criticize. We did it so well, they're talking about the backroom stuff that really the voters aren't interested in. They just wanted a good election, and that's what we gave them.
So final question here is, as we mentioned earlier, that Reginald Boulding has also announced his campaign for Secretary of State's office. Final question, why should a voter out there, looking at this race, why should they pick you over him?
Well, Reginald Boulding is a good and decent man, but I think at the end of the day, the voters are going to look to experience. They're going to look to folks who have done the job and will continue to do the job. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion about specifically that, substance, experience, and at the end of the day, how we're going to keep the fascists and authoritarians over on the Fincham-Ugenti camp out of this office.
All right, that's Adrian Fontes, a Democratic candidate for the Secretary of State's office. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And earlier this week, we talked to other candidates running for Secretary of State. Now, House Minority Leader Reginald Boulding is a former teacher, and he says he originally ran for the office to help tackle education in our state. He tells us he's running to stand up for voting rights and democracy now.
Now, what we're seeing with regards to democracy, no matter if you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, I think everyone is ready for some common sense when it comes to democracy, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in elections. And I've led the charge on that fight on the floor of the state legislature. And now it's time to make sure that we have that same voice leading our state as the Secretary of State.
And we also talked to State Senator Michelle Ugenti-Rita about her vision for the office.
We want to restore confidence in our election system so that people want to engage in it and vote. The first thing I would do is push back on county recorders and the Board of Supervisors, making sure that I'm shining a light on the administration and management of elections. Remember, elections are run at the county level. Right now, they have gone for far too long without proper scrutiny.
And we also talked to Republican candidate Mark Fincham about the importance of election integrity.
We all want to make sure that every vote counts, every legal vote counts, because when votes that aren't legal are included in the system, that disenfranchises voters. That's called nullification. And that is every bit as important as voter suppression, where people are prevented from voting.
And you can watch the full interviews with Boulding, Fincham, and Ugenti-Rita for free on the AZ Family app and azfamily.com. But still ahead, this wildfire season has been devastating for our state, so now lawmakers are taking action to respond to the crisis. We'll tell you what they're doing coming up next on Politics Unplugged. And Welcome back to Politics Unplugged. It was a busy week at the Arizona Capitol during a special session. State lawmakers overwhelmingly passed legislation for funding to respond to the current and future fire crises. Now, the governor called for a special session last week to tackle this emergency. The bill appropriates about $100 million, not only for responding to the fires now, but for recovery efforts that will surely be needed later. And part of the money will be used to pay for more state prisoners so they can help clear, wildfire areas of brush and other flammable materials, purchase new vehicles, and help property owners recover. And with me now to discuss this is Jim Small from the Arizona Mirror and Julia Shumway from the Arizona Capital Times. And I want to start with you, Julia. Let's talk a little bit about, this happened pretty quickly. The governor calls the special session for the fires just last week, and it passes with overwhelming bipartisan support. But Democrats were raising some issues about this, particularly about climate change.
Right. So Democrats in the House and Senate, including at least one or a couple who decided not to vote for the bill, said that this special session, while they liked the idea of putting more money toward fighting fires, they said it wasn't quite enough to just hand out money to fight fires if we're not going to look at the root causes, which they described as climate change that is causing more and more dangerous weather conditions, wildfires in the West, hurricanes in coastal areas, a lot more extreme weather conditions.
And what are Republicans telling you about that?
Republicans do not want to talk about climate change, which makes sense. This isn't legislation that they consider most years. Democrats will introduce bills trying to address human impacts on the climate, and Republicans don't give them hearings. A lot of them have talked about how, they remember being in school in the 70s and hearing about global cooling, and now they're hearing about global warming, and they don't know that they just don't truly believe that this is something that humans are having an impact on.
All right, now let's move on to the other thing. While they can move pretty quickly when it comes to responding to this fire emergency, Jim, they're not moving pretty quickly at all when it comes to this budget right now. Doesn't look like we have any sort of deal yet anytime soon, and we are running up against that July 1st deadline. It's the beginning of the new fiscal year for the state, and after that, if there's no budget deal done, there's a big question of how state operations get paid for.
Yeah, I think what the latest development really is here is that Republican leaders, at least in one chamber in the State House of Representatives, are saying that they're going to move forward and just put up what's called a skinny budget, which essentially is basically just a budget that maintains current spending, doesn't add money for any new projects, doesn't do any of the things that Republicans had worked together, both Doug Ducey and Republican legislative leaders. And instead, they're just going to kind of maintain a status quo, all because they can't come to a deal on this budget, mostly on the tax component of it, on the quote unquote flat tax that the governor's office has been pushing, which takes about $1.9 billion annually out of state spending, out of state revenue. And there's a couple of Republicans that are holding out on that, and that still remains as the biggest obstacle to getting a budget done. And if they can't hammer out a compromise on that, then it looks like we're going to see maybe a standoff on the budget package. As to whether they're going to do just a status quo budget or whether they're going to continue to try to negotiate something further.
I want to talk to you a little bit about that budget, that flat tax, that tax cut the governor is really pushing for. Now, we've seen some analysis that the lion's share of those tax savings will go to the top income earners here in Arizona. Is this a way to kind of backdoor the Prop 208 initiative that was passed in November to help fund education by taxing wealthy Arizonans? And if that is the case, this would just be the latest attempt that we've seen from this legislature, Republican-controlled legislature, to appear to thwart the will of the voters.
Oh, it definitely is. And they've made no bones about the fact that their entire goal is to undercut the tax increase that voters approved in November. Voters said that they wanted to add a 3.5% surcharge on the marginal income of the wealthiest Arizonans, so all income above $250,000 for individuals or $500,000 for joint filers. That there was going to be an extra tax on that. All that money was going to be dedicated to the public school system, and in particular toward raising wages for teachers. And Republicans and the big business groups that fought against that measure obviously did not like that outcome, and so they have spent the entire year trying to figure out ways that they can try to essentially lessen that tax burden and make sure that rich Arizonans don't have to pay it. And so what they came up with in this flat tax is actually not a flat tax. It's two tiers. It's one tier for every Arizonan who makes less than that top bracket, that $500,000 per family, and then a lower tier for that family to basically make sure for those high-end earners to make sure that they don't pay really a dime more than what they pay right now. And that's, like you said, Dennis, I mean, that has resulted in something like 80 or 85% of the tax cuts going toward that high-end bracket. And while it's technically a tax cut for everybody, the lower you get down and the closer you get down to the median income for Arizona, the more you're looking at a tax cut over the span of a year of maybe a few $100s, as opposed to some of the folks on the high end who stand to save tens of thousands of dollars every year in tax.
Yeah, and Julia, can you tell us a little bit about what some of these Republican holdouts, what they're wanting out of this? We know over in the House, David Cook has been somebody who's not on this budget deal and the tax plan so far. And over in the Senate, it's Senator Paul Boyer, who's no stranger to being in opposition to his party on these issues. Can you explain to us a little bit about what they want?
Right. So the big thing that both Representative Cook and Senator Boyer really want is a tax deal that will not reduce funding for cities. So right now, if you reduce income taxes, you're cutting state shared revenue that goes to cities. Cities anticipate that could be about a 31% cut to the revenue they get from the state. So they want to increase the amount cities get. They also want to pay down a lot more debt, arguing that if you pay down some more of the debt that Arizona owes, that has the same benefits as having a tax cut without, like, you don't have to make as much payments toward debt because you paid it down. And then there are some other Republicans who have a number of other issues for opposing it. You've got some folks in both the House and the Senate who think that this budget has too much spending. And in one particularly interesting one, Senator Kelly Townsend announced that she does not want to vote for a budget until after we do an audit of Proposition 208, the new tax on the wealthy, because she's not entirely sure it actually passed. It did, to be clear, pass with 100,000 votes, almost 3.5% across the state.
All right. And final question, I did want to get to this, and I'll keep it open, whoever wants to handle this one. But we saw a recall effort led by conservative groups, Republican groups, against Republican Speaker of the House, Rusty Bowers. It didn't seem to go very well for them trying to recall Mr. Bowers. It failed. But why were they trying to recall him?
Well, Speaker Bowers both allowed the state to shut down and allowed the legislature to adjourn sine die last year. And then this year, he hasn't been supportive of attempts to audit the election. He came out and told fellow Republicans that it was over. Joe Biden won. He didn't like the result, but that was that. And because of this, he's one of a number of politicians, including all 5 county supervisors, Governor Ducey, Secretary Hobbs, Senator Boyer faces 2 of them, who have had conservative groups come out and file recall petitions, but none of them have gone anywhere.
All right. I want to thank both of you, Julia Shumway from the Arizona Capital Times and Jim Small from the Arizona Mirror. I want to thank you both for spending some time here with us today. But up next, I'm bringing in our panel to talk about all of the major headlines this week. That's next here on Politics Unplugged. And welcome back to Politics Unplugged. It is now time to talk it out with political consultants Roy Herrera, the Democrat here, and Stan Barnes, the longtime Republican. I want to start with you, Roy. How important are these Secretary of State's races across the country and here in Arizona going to be, considering what we saw play out in November of 2020?
Extremely important. I mean, I would venture to say they're going to be as important as any other office that's on the ballot this year. And it's precisely because of a lot of the efforts we've seen in state legislatures across the country, including here in Arizona, to pass bills that would either result in voter suppression or make significant changes to existing election administration and election systems to make it harder for people to vote. And I think in Arizona, we have the fortune of having one of the best election systems in the country. And yet we have seen proposals down at the Capitol by Republicans to make it harder to vote and to, really change the way we do things here, which is unnecessary. And so whoever's, the nominee is going to have to, on the Democratic side, is going to have to defend that system and fight back against a lot of these efforts. So it's going to be hugely important. And I think you're going to see a ton of money being invested in this race next year.
And Stan, I want to ask you about this. You just heard some of Adrian Fontes' interview here now. Not to make too much of a sports analogy here, but he's coming off a big loss in November. He's going to be running for this statewide. Can he win statewide when you consider, last November, he lost Maricopa County. Again, the same election cycle that someone like a Paul Penzone, also a Democrat, was the top vote getter. Mr. Penzone got more votes even than Joe Biden in Maricopa County.
Yeah, I think our Democratic friends wrongly think they have wind in their sails on the statewide campaign in Arizona because Mark Kelly and Kirsten Sinema both won U.S. Senate seats. But it's my opinion, my Democratic friends continue to have a headwind and not a tailwind, because this is still a center-right state. And the only way Democrats get elected statewide in Arizona is to act like Republicans. And Kirsten Sinema is living it out right now, much to Roy and some Democratic friends' angst about her activity there. Can Fontes act like a Republican or a centrist or an independent and talk about the election? Maybe. He's got something to talk about. I mean, after all, he was in the middle of it. But I think he's on the weak side of it. I think the majority of the voters in an off-presidential election statewide are center-right voters, and they're going to be a little suspicious of a former Democratic leader of that office on the Maricopa County level.
And I want to keep it with you, Stan, real quick. I want to switch over to talk about the latest entrant for the gubernatorial race, the Republican, Matt Salmon. 20 years after he tried and was narrowly defeated, he is running for that office again. How does this shake up the race? You've also got Karen Robeson-Taylor running for the seat, Kimberly Yee, the state treasurer, as well as the former news anchor, Carrie Lake.
Yeah, I think it dramatically shakes it up, but he does bring a lot of skill to the table. He can raise money. He knows how to talk to voters. For me, it's those candidates you name plus others that will probably come in. The whole thing will be managing the Trump politics, which is the dominant politics of the Republican turnout electorate, and then converting that into a general election campaign and still winning the overall race.
And Roy, it looks like the Democratic field is pretty much set. I don't know if we're going to get. I don't think we're going to get any more major candidates in that race. We've, got Katie Hobbs running for that, and Marco Lopez, a former staffer for then Governor Janet Napolitano. How do you see, that race playing out for the next year until that August primary in 2022?
Well, I kind of bring it back to a point that Stan just made, which I agree with, is the Republican primary is going to be very interesting to watch because it's going to be interesting to see which candidates sort of get the Trump endorsement, how hard the different candidates go after getting support from Donald Trump. And I think ultimately on the Democratic side, the closer that the Republicans are to Donald Trump, the closer they are to this audit, for example, the closer they are to allegations that somehow the November election last year was wrong, the better it is for Democrats. And so a lot of it is going to be very interesting to watch on the Republican side to see who wants to, get Trump's endorsement or who wants to be more of a moderate, which I think ultimately is what is successful statewide.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. That is all the time we have tonight, but be sure to join us next week for more Politics Unplugged.